right, thank you, everybody. How are you doing today? Well, I guess to start off, how many people in here do we have on like the blue team, defenders? A couple handfuls. Any penetration testers or red teamers? Okay, a couple there too. Any students? Okay, cool. All right, anybody that's in audit or any other management, things like that? Okay. So pretty good variety, a lot of blue teamers. So this talk, we'll first start out. Who am I? I'm a hacker, Matt Dunn, a penetration tester. I run an offensive consulting team. I build hackers, so I take interns and regular IT people and I turn them evil and steal them from my IT department. And I love open source software. All right, so I want to set some expectations for this talk. I gave it to my wife last night, and she does a lot of presentations, and she was like, wow, that's terrible. And I'm like, fuck, it's like 11 o'clock. And so this morning I made some tweaks to it, and hopefully it'll be a little bit better. And I'm trying to fit a lot of information in, but well, I'll do the best I can. All right, so what I'm going to talk about, it's mostly from looking at a couple of offensive tactics, how to think offensively to secure your network. And so the talk, I had a lot more details, but it's got to be a little bit higher level because of the time constraints. Any offensive techniques that I'll be sharing during this presentation, you need permission to perform first. If you don't have permission, you could be committing a crime. So don't be, cracking your Active Directory database passwords to see who has shitty passwords, or things like that without permission. And I'll talk about network discovery, that I think is something that's sometimes overlooked with like vulnerability management programs. We'll talk about attacking and defending some common password issues, and stealing credentials from memory, and also analyzing Active Directory environments. And then we'll finish up with talking about using the MITRE ATT&CK framework to think offensively and tune your defense, or if you're an attacker, to tune how you're performing your engagements. All right, so when I'm first enumerating a network, some of the things that I look for are items that don't belong on the internet. So if I'm doing an external penetration test, I want to look for Citrix management interfaces that are accidentally exposed to the internet and have default credentials. And this is something that I see with a lot of vulnerability management programs, is that things like that will be missed because they won't hit on a vulnerability scanner. But if you are doing like an Nmap scan and evaluating the things on your external network outside of the vulnerabilities, that's something that you could pick up. Default or non-existent passwords. I go into a lot of environments like colleges like this, and I can log into half the security cameras with the password admin from the guest wireless network sometimes. That's kind of scary. Other things with enumeration, you can look for things that are in incorrect network segments. So oftentimes, I think it's hard to understand what is on our networks unless we're auditing them. And so we might find IoT devices or thermostats plugged into the corporate network, and maybe they should be on a different VLAN that's isolated. Anything that looks really old, that always interests me. So oftentimes, I'll find things, and I'll go to the IT team and be like, what's this? I'm like, oh, that should have been taken off the network 3 years ago. And that's the potential to have, some vulnerabilities or something I can take advantage of there. A couple simple ways to find things are using tools like Nmap and Eyewitness. Nmap, how many people here are familiar with Nmap? Oh, almost everybody, great. So I won't go into too many details with that, but it's a port scanner, so you can use it to see what systems and services are running on different network segments. You can also do a little bit of vulnerability scanning with it and a lot of other things. Here's an example of Nmap being run. We got some open ports. There's a lot of documentation on Nmap if you want to utilize it on larger networks more quickly, or to fit your use case, and that can be found at the Nmap website. There's a bunch of blogs. I'm sure you guys are familiar with those. One thing I do to take my Nmap data to the next level, I'm a pretty visual person, So oftentimes I'll be looking at a network and I want to understand what's on the network quickly. And if I have like 1,000 or 100 or 300 web ports hit, I might want to see very quickly what all those systems are. So I'll run a tool like Eyewitness, which will go out and load web pages and screenshot them. And so I can see very quickly, okay, where are the VPN portals at? Is there like Outlook web access page? Pretty quickly by generating a report with Eyewitness. And it generates an HTML report like the one in this example. And on the right, it has a screenshot of the web page. The left side, it has some of the web request info. And if it's a device that's in its database of default passwords, it might tell you, hey, this is a Tomcat server. Typically, the password for that's Tomcat, and you could try that. You can also have the tool guess the passwords if you want to. Again, you need permission to do that. If you do that against systems you don't own that, and you log into them, that could be a problem. How to utilize what you find from your enumeration is be looking for gaps. So are there systems that don't belong in places? If there are, why are they there? And get them off of there. If there's old systems, get rid of them, isolate them, update them. If there's default logins, figure out who is responsible for those systems and make them change them so that the printer can't be used as a beacon point into your network. All right, now I'll talk a little bit about weak passwords. So when I'm talking about weak passwords, anything that's default, easily guessed, or easily cracked. This is one of my favorite types of things to attack because it's pretty easy and I'm pretty lazy. But default passwords, we talked about those, admin, things like that. Easy to guess passwords. So these are passwords like season and year, company name 1. So if I get a list of users for your organization, one of the first things I'm going to do is find your VPN or your Outlook web access or your Office 365 and try, right now, fall 2019 against everybody's account and see if that hits, if anybody has that password. Password reuse. So if I land on a system and the user has local administrator access and I can have full control of that system, I might dump the local passwords or hashes on that system. If they're reused across the whole network or across several accounts, that allows me to move laterally very quickly through the network. So that's something to watch out for. And so why should we care about weak passwords? I'm in a lot of environments where the IT passwords are actually really good, but the user passwords aren't necessarily good. And typically, the IT stance is, well, who cares about the basic users? And the reason that we need to care about them is because it only takes one weak link for me to get into a network, only one account that doesn't have two-factor authentication enabled, I get into an email or a VPN, and I'm on the network. And it typically isn't very difficult for myself or for an attacker, once you're initially in the network, to move up the ladder and gain full access to the network. And so one way, I talked a little bit about I like to guess commonly used passwords using a technique called password guessing or spraying. And that's like password brute forcing, but done at a rate below a lockout threshold. So I'm not locking everybody out of an organization. It also is a little less likely to be detected if I'm not locking a lot of accounts out. And standard password complexity requirements don't block easy to guess passwords by themselves, so it's still a very effective technique. And some of the tools that you can use to do password guessing or password spraying, Burp Suite is a web application testing tool that has capabilities to do password spraying. One of my coworkers wrote the tool Spray Charles, which is a command line Linux utility to do password spraying. It has modules for things like Outlook web access, Office 365, and it's set up so that you can put in the lockout thresholds and it'll stay below those. You can also route the traffic through a proxy if you want to be more stealthy. Domain password spray is a utility, a PowerShell-based password spraying tool that you can use on an internal or potentially an external network on a Windows network. All All right, and so what do I do with passwords when I get them or an attacker gets them? We log into things, right? So log into email. Can I get into the VPN? Does anything not have two-factor on it? If it has two-factor on it, has the person not enrolled yet? Then I can enroll myself. My new favorite, well, it's not my new favorite thing. Something I've been having a lot of success with lately is I get one basic account. I log into the help desk ticketing system, and I create a ticket, and I say, hey, oh man, this Excel file, I'm having trouble loading all the data in it. Can you please help me? And I submit the ticket as a regular user. I delete, the help desk response from their email, and then the help desk looks at it, and I launch the malware on their system, and now I have help desk access from a basic user account. Another thing I may do is use tools to see what I can do with my passwords. So once I have credentials, I want to utilize them across the network. Nmap exec is a Linux tool that's very easy to take passwords or hashes and try to use them to connect to systems. You can do SQL queries, you can run commands on systems, you can steal passwords with MeMeCats, all kind of things. One example I might use is, okay, I've gotten a local administrator password. Is that valid on another system? And so here you're going to see an example. I'm using the password administrator and password. I pointed at the system. It came back as green. That means the password is valid. If it's got the yellow pwn, it means I have local administrator access on that computer and probably full control of that system to steal more passwords from, launch other attacks from it, whatever. It'll also tell you if the password is valid but the account's disabled, or if the password is invalid. And that's just like one example. You can do that manually, or there's many other tools. Defending against weak passwords. So we talked a little bit about weak passwords. That there are a lot of ways. It's not very difficult to defend against weak passwords. What I recommend doing first is evaluating the passwords that you have. Where do you stand? One tool to do that is called DS Internals. It's a PowerShell module. And what it does is it takes a copy of your Active Directory database with the passwords in it, and you can do some password cracking against it if you want to. You could feed it like a password dictionary and see, is anybody using weak passwords. You don't have to do that if you don't have authorization to crack people's passwords. You can actually run it, and it'll show you how many people have the same password. And that can be a good indication of are users using weak passwords, because if you have a group of 10, 20 passwords that are the same in their user accounts, they're probably using something like winter 2019. You can also see, are your IT people, your admins that have their mortal account and then their admin account, are they using the same password for both of those? I've been in situations where we got access to a mortal account, and we saw that this username was similar to an admin account. We tried the password on the admin account, it was the same. And then we had a lot more access to the network. The best way, though, to actually to deal with bad passwords is just to prevent them. And you can use password filtering tools. CredDefense is an open source one. You can do it manually with Windows. Nixus and Enfront are paid products. I don't think they're very expensive from what people I've talked to that have used them before. But basically, you give it a list of passwords that meet complexity requirements, but you don't want to allow the sports team in the area and year, season and year. You could even give it a list of the top 10,000 bad passwords, things like that. They're very configurable, and that'll actually prevent people from selecting bad passwords. The networks that use these, I have some banks that use these, it's impossible to guess passwords there, and it's very difficult to crack passwords if you have pretty strict rules in place. To deal with local admin password reuse, the best way to deal with that is to have a solution that manages the passwords for you and randomizes them. Microsoft Lapse is a solution that does that. Probably if you're on the defense, you're familiar with that. Some smaller shops sometimes I find aren't familiar with tools like that, but it's a free solution that will manage local administrator passwords and deploy different ones to each system. All right, so detecting bad password activity. A couple things to look for. There's more things you can look for, but Windows Event ID 4625 login failure If you see a lot of those or more than normal, it might mean that somebody is running password guessing against you. And the number, the threshold will vary upon your organization. Now, if you're authenticating through some other methods, it won't trigger that event ID. It'll trigger event ID 4771. So if you're doing password guesses against the LDAP service, I guess that'll trigger that different event ID. So if you're only looking at 4625, you might be missing password guessing attempts. You may also want to watch successes. A lot of places I work with are able to detect password guessing, particularly if it's coming from one IP address, but they often cannot tell me which accounts I compromised. And that's pretty important. Okay, so maybe you blocked the attacker, but did they compromise any accounts? And that goes to having all the logs you need. So other times I'll find that an alert won't trigger because maybe the VPN or another external service isn't feeding into the same SIEM or the logs aren't there, and so it's not triggering an alert. Another way to detect bad password activity on your network is to have honey accounts that are never used. So creating like a disabled account, creating an account and disabling it. That way, if somebody dumps your user database and knows all your usernames and is guessing passwords against all of them, you would get a failed attempt on that account, which should never be logged into. And I've caught that way before on penetration tests, which I thought was pretty cool. I like to get caught. I mean, it means it's good for my clients and they're improving. So once we have credentials or have some kind of access to a network, we want to go deeper. And one way to do that is by stealing credentials from memory. So a lot of systems will hold passwords or other authentication mechanisms in memory, and we can steal those to further access on the network. So MeMeCats is like one of the most popular tools to do that. Here's an example of running MeMeCats on a Windows 7 system, and by default you can get clear text credentials from that. You can see the highlighted red there, that's the password, and then the hashes are above that. By default in Windows 10, that's disabled. Can be re-enabled, so you want to watch that. But in this case, we just get the hash. We can still use the hash, or we can try to crack it or try to pass it, but we don't have the clear text password, which can limit what all we can do with it. And you can actually defend against MeMeCats. It's not overly complicated. It uses the SE debug privilege to do a lot of the things that it does. So if you disable that via a group policy and don't allow anybody to do that, to access that, then a lot of MeMeCat's features will not work. You can also disable wdigest, which you should do, particularly on Windows 7 systems. Hopefully you don't have any of those left. That'll also prevent getting some of those clear text. Credential guard is also a Windows feature that provides more protections to the LSA process, which is in memory, and where we often steal the passwords from or authentication mechanisms. And there can be some issues with single sign-on when using that, but it's something that you could use. And I've seen people use that on like jump boxes and things like that, high-risk systems. EDR solutions are also pretty good at protecting the LSAS process, so they'll watch that, and if anything unusual tries to access it, they'll prevent that. You can also detect MeMeCats if you have a SIEM or a tool monitoring event logs. If you look at event ID 4688 and you want to look for things like memecats.exe, secure LSA, even if somebody changes the executable, a lot of times they won't change the commands within it, so you can still pick it up by the commands being run. In sysmon, you can look for the same indicators with event ID 1, and MeMeCats also has YARA rules included with on GitHub. So once we have credentials, we need to know what we can do with them. How many people have used Bloodhound here? Not too many. So Bloodhound is an Active Directory enumeration tool. It has support for Windows and Linux. You can run the data ingester as any domain user. So I can pull a lot of information out of Active Directory as any domain user. And it helps an attacker and a defender look for possible privileged escalation paths. So if I compromise an account and I have the Bloodhound output, I can pull up the nice interface here and say, okay, I have Jim's account. Is there a path for me to get to domain admin from here? And it'll tell you, yes, okay, Jim can log into system 2, which has a domain admin logged in. He probably he has local admin rights there. If you can log into that system and steal that domain admin's password, then you're a domain admin. So this can help you, from a defensive side, look at, are there people that have overly permissive access in terms of local administrator rights? Is it very easy to get to your domain admins and privileged accounts? You can actually prevent Bloodhound from running and defend against privilege abuse. The best thing to do with that is to use least privilege if you can. So giving users the least amount of privilege they need to do their job. That makes it a lot harder if you get an account to utilize it to move throughout the network. You can use Bloodhound to find weak links and then break them. And you can actually detect Bloodhound being run by creating tiny tokens. And there's a link here. I'll provide the slides on Twitter later if you want to go through and have the links. You can also use adsecurity.org's tips for breaking Bloodhound that'll allow it to run for your defensive team, but not for just anybody on the network, which would prevent attackers from using a tool or a tool like that. Ping Castle is worth mentioning. It's an AD audit tool that has some kind of similar features of Bloodhound. It's a paid tool, but there is a free version. It'll look for, do you have passwords stored in your group policy, things like that. All right, now that we've looked at really just a small number of attack techniques, and some of those aren't even really what I would consider attack techniques, just like enumeration. But one of the things that I find when I'm doing security assessments is that people have defensive tool sets in place. They won't necessarily always test them to see how well they work. And then when I come in or my team comes in, we test them and it doesn't work how they think it works or it doesn't work at all. And so I highly recommend, if you're not using it, using the MITRE ATT&CK framework as an attacker or as a defender to measure your defense. And so what the MITRE ATT&CK, how many people are familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework? Okay, great, a lot of people. If you're not familiar with it, it's this matrix of attack categories. So you have initial access, all different ways you could get that, phishing, supply chain, execution, all different methods of executing code on a system, and so on. And so how you want to use MITRE ATT&CK to strengthen your defense or your offense is to, from a defensive perspective, looking at what are the common attacks in your industry, or just the common attacks overall, and seeing how you fare against those. Can you detect that? Can you prevent it? If you can't, why not? And fix that. This is one thing that when I do purple team assessments that we utilize heavily. So I'll go in with one of my defensive team members, and maybe I'll run the attacks. We'll look at MITRE ATT&CK, work with the organization, and say, okay, these are the areas you're concerned about. Let's start with these. We'll pick a handful of categories and a handful of techniques, and then we'll run the attack. Okay, is the logging in place to detect that? Okay, it is. Great. Is that feeding to the SIEM? Are you alerting on it? Okay, good, you are. Is it being prevented? And then we'll look at, okay, here's the prevention control for that to prevent that from being successful also. All right, I managed to get through all those slides pretty quickly. I was worried I didn't have enough time. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't bore you too much. If you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to talk about anything after the talk. I'll be around, or reach out to me on Twitter, or my email's there. We might have okay, take a couple questions. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, great. Thank you very much.